Hello everyone, thank you so much for being here live, and thank you so much to you guys who are watching on demand. Today we have the wonderful Ian Andrews talking about his practice. So once this is been recorded, if you can like, comment, share, that will really help us out. If you have any questions for Ian during his talk or drawings, please make sure to use the chat box and click it to panelists and attendees, or you can use the Q&A feature and you can be anonymous to ask your questions. So I'll pass it over to Ian now.
Thank you. And firstly, thank you to Kirstie for inviting me. Right, the plan is to outline a project I've been working on for oh gosh, I think it must be about 5 years now, but it's certainly 4 years, with Professor Kostas Nikolopoulos from the particle physics group at the University of Birmingham. And it's called The Sketchbook and the Collider. If he's listening, he will probably tell me later whether he thinks I've pronounced his name correctly. He says sometimes I do and sometimes I don't, but we'll see how we go. So I'm going to attempt, and those of you who know me will know how difficult this will be. We're going to attempt to show some slides, go to a webcam and look at some books, and go back to some slides, go to the webcam, and I'll do some drawing and try and explain why things look like they do, and then finish off with a few more slides. All of which should take about an hour, and then there'll be time if you want to ask questions. You can do, or you can just make a beeline for the freezer to get yourself a giant lolly. Okay, so if you want to know more, then the sketchbookandthecollider.com is the website to go to. If you want to talk to me directly, that's my email address, which you could also come at me from the website, as it were, a link through from the website. And if anyone's really interested, give me a ring. I am desperately trying to reach out to people of like mind, and I'll explain what that means in a minute. What I'm going to do is, and this bit will be the same if you've heard me talk before, I'm going to show some slides of the one of the exhibitions that Kostas and I have done together, which was at the Library of Birmingham, called Collision Event. And while I'm talking about the project generally, I'll be flicking through those in the background, as it were. And here we are, the Sketchbook and the Collider. Kostas is on the left, as you look at the screen, and I'm on the right. As you can probably tell. And this is our appropriate stand-ins, if you like. On the right-hand side of the screen, we've got not the collider, really. It's only one part of the collider. It's one of the detectors. And it's just slipped through my brain which detector it is. I think it's Alice, but it could be Atlas. But they are enormous. And that's just one of 4 detectors that are stationed within CERN. And so anyway, how did we come to work together? Kostas did a talk at Eastside Projects in Birmingham and was introducing particle physics research as part of a radical sabbatical scheme where there was a little bit of funding to work with an academic and compare research methodologies. I thought it's a fabulous idea, and I was vaguely aware of cloud chamber photographs, which we'll see later. And so I went along to the talk to see if I could link with a physicist, because I knew someone was going to be there from the particle physics group. And we applied. We got on well right from the word go. I went to the university to visit him. And one of the things that we bonded over quite early was that although he was a bit skeptical that there was any kind of link between fine art and particle physics, it became clear when we actually started talking to each other that actually there was quite a lot of connection. He's exposing. I must just tell you, he's come online. He's come online when he talks to you. I'm exposing the elements that make up reality, the elemental particles that make up reality. Well, I mean, as an artist, how can you resist somebody or a subject that is absolutely about exposing the elemental building blocks that makes up our world? You know, you can't say, well, I'm going to finish my landscape painting and then I'll have to think about it. It's such a fabulously integral, elemental thing that it just had to be embraced within my practice. And one of the things that we came to the conclusion was that my use of the sketchbook, and I assume it's the same for every artist, is not that dissimilar to the use of the collider, the particle accelerators, the detectors that the physicists use to find these elemental building blocks of reality. And although they are huge, CERN is 27 kilometers, a giant circle. And although they are 100 meters underground, and although they cost billions of dollars, and my sketchbook costs £6.50 from W.H. Smith, nevertheless, the same thing's going on. They throw things together, hurtle things together at enormous energies, and see what comes out. That's kind of what I do in a sketchbook. You're constantly throwing things in there, trying to see what will come out, that you can develop your practice, that collision, to see what it could lead to. So that's where the sketchbook and the collider name comes from. So these are shots of the library exhibition, and I'm now going to sort of talk about the general points that we started to explore together, I suppose. And of course, the first problem was, well, how do I respond to this? You can't see these particles. You can only see traces in a detector, in a medium in a detector, where they've been. I started making films to start with, which turned out to be quite a useful thing to do. But in retrospect, I was trying to work from a metaphor point of view. So he would tell me about fields, that particles have fields, and they should be thought of as vibrations within the fields rather than little hard marbles. And I would try and find a way of responding to that with fabric that I would shake with talcum powder in it, so that the sort of smoke emanated from it. But it was always a sort of a dust emanated from it. But it was always a sort of an analogy, a metaphor. And so I needed a way of responding. And I suddenly realized that what he was doing was stripping reality back to its basic components, and that my response would be to do the same to my practice, which was at that stage ridiculously, well, excitingly perhaps, but it was installational based. It was massive installations. There were found objects, paintings, sculptures, all being used. It was to do with the breakdown of logic, I suppose, is the quickest way of describing it. And sorry, I lost my train of thought for a minute. And I haven't got it back again. My apologies. So we're looking around the library, and so I stripped the drawing back. I stripped my practice back, right back down. And what does my practice entail? Well, at its raw, basic element, it's drawing. And with drawing, it's point, line, and shape. And it's the interaction of point, line, and shape, and the visual forces that operate between them, that I started to explore. Films re-emerged, and we're going to have a look at a few, but very differently. No longer were they metaphors for something that was happening at the quantum level. They were more elemental elements being manipulated and animated. Oh, is this by magic? So the films were really moving drawings. Sometimes they were projected, sometimes they would be shown on screen as if framed, but they were effectively moving drawings rather than a metaphor or an analogy for something that was happening on a quantum level. Although, if I go back to that one and then freeze it, however, they were sort of specifically referring to elements in the quantum world. So there are straight elements, there are curved elements, and there are tones merging or holding these two elements together. And that was a direct reference to quarks and the strong force that was holding the quarks together. We'll find out a bit more about quarks in a moment. So they could be seen in quite illustrational terms in some ways. But you don't need to know that in order to enjoy them as films, because they are visual events in their own right. There are visual forces operating between the different components, just as they are referring to different components, just different elemental particles in the standard model, the quarks. Right, I'm going to flick through these. Although I should just say it was a huge privilege that the project got underway with a vengeance when I was offered a residency at the University of Birmingham. We were rejected for the Eastside project one, so we didn't get that, but Costas and I had hit it off and we decided we'd carry on regardless. And so I used to go over to the university once a month, I suppose. It wasn't a regular timetabled thing, as it were. But we continued our conversation, and we continued to find areas that seemed to be relevant to us both from the point of view of the material cultures surrounding our different areas, the sketchbook and my equipment, and the collider and his equipment. And some of the pieces you're looking at now reference some of the historic equipment that, again, I'll be showing you a bit later on. So we kept finding things that we thought were appropriate to us both, really. Him exposing these invisible, hard to reach things, and me saying, well, that's an artist. An artist kind of tries to get at things that are psychological, emotional, or ideas that are fairly intangible, and tries to bring them out into the into visibility, and that's what you're doing. So we bonded over the technical, material, cultural side of it, the kit, but also conceptually over the ways we were approaching things as research. Excuse me. So we'll talk about some of these a bit later on in terms of why they look like they do. There are constant references back because I was at the university. It was a huge privilege to be there. But the project took on a historical point of view, and I got shown archival photographs from the collection, and I became interested in the history of particle physics, and so it had a slight historical context at one stage, which had to go in the end. It wasn't. I was looking for raw equivalence between my language, point, line, and plane, and the elemental particles and what they were doing, how they were interacting, how they were transforming, annihilating, how they were changing from energy to mass and mass to energy. So there's this constant choreography going on in the quantum world, and I wanted to try and get at that through my drawing. But an equivalence to, not an illustration of. I think that was the big move away from those early films. I haven't shown you any of the films that I showed you, are ones where I'm really making moving drawings. But away from metaphor and into an equivalence. And the project involved, as you can probably see, films, but also light boxes and light box pieces and things like this. And Paul Clay became incredibly significant on the Bauhaus lectures, the Thinking Eye, and his idea of taking a line for a walk and freeing up the visual elements so that they are pure and not sullied by attempts to depict unnecessary figurative subjects. But figurative subjects can emerge if it naturally happens, as you probably, if you know Paul Clay's work, it's as figurative as it is abstract. So this was a lightbox piece at the library, and the interesting thing from an engagement point of view is that the pupils that we had to do some of the workshops rubbed the top of the plastic covering, and the static made some of the plastic filaments that the drawings were made out of stick to the top of the plastic through static electricity. So it was a brilliant example of physics in operation, and is something that I want to do something with, really, when I get a minute. The pandemic has rather made certain forms of engagement a little bit difficult, because another one of the things that we do together is live drawing, where we invite people to join us and add to a giant drawing sheet of paper, which is then projected and recorded. That's all had to stop, unfortunately. Now, what I'm going to try and do now is, this is also backing up the project is a series of books. In fact, it started with the hand-drawn book. This is one of a series where only the edges of the book are drawn on. Is there another one? Yes, there is. There we go. So only the edges are drawn on. And the books have got loads of pages. I mean, ridiculous amounts of pages. And this series in particular came about because at one point Costa said to me, I'm writing a program to analyze existing data. I don't need beam time. I don't need to go to CERN and fire up the beam. I just need to reanalyze the data that we've already got, because there are so many collision events happening at CERN when it's operational, the colossal amount of data that is stored, and not everything that they have is kept. But he said, I'm going to reanalyze. I think I know a different place to look. And because I had books on the go at that point, I loved the idea of perhaps making some books where the main bulk of the page was empty and all the information and all the excitement, if that's the word, is happening in the edges. So yes, so the books have run alongside the project, and when we have a quick look at some of the university work, you could argue that all of it was based from the books that I was making at the time. Here we go. So we're going to have a look at some of the books that have been running alongside the project. I've done it like this so that it's almost like you're looking over my shoulder. I thought it would be more intimate than trying to get a camera that's directly above it. You may be wondering why on earth has he got it skew-if, but the idea was that you're looking over my shoulder. These are all on tissue paper, so they leak through, they seep through. They're monoprinting type techniques. So just as the traces of the particles are left in a detector, in an enabling medium, depends how early the detector was as to what that medium might be, but the particles interact with something in the detector and they form a series of interactions which are then footprints, if you like, of the particles. So this was one of my early attempts to create a coded sequence of shapes and marks and lines, the point becoming the line becoming the shape implying 3 dimensions in some instances because of repetition in certain areas, and then tone adding to the density of the visual experience, the visual force of tone coming into play. And you can see that they're transparent up to a point, so you can see different layers through. And you can probably see the fan that I've got strategically positioned is doing its best to take some of these off. So this was one of the first books were full of information. This was my first attempt to say, wait a minute, let's not kind of go crazy. Let's in a spirit of editing all the time, because Costas is constantly after the elemental particles and the elemental interactions. So I constantly try and cut back, edit. So this was a big advance for me because it just is one line that runs across, but the line goes on a journey. You can hear Paul Clay talking. This one has got letter set. It's probably not amazingly obvious from the angle you're looking at it, but there are letter set symbols being used. And you can see I'm finally having the confidence in this one to have very little going on in some instances. And that very little going on gets taken to extreme lengths in this series, which are called Score for Particles. I was lucky enough at the university to meet some wonderful people, and it truly was an enriching experience. And Maria was very interested in music and acoustics. That was her. So the idea of trying to almost make a score for particles rather than trying to illustrate them became one of my ambitions. This is probably not looking that fascinating. Again, one thing I would like to say is you can see how many pages there are. Now that refers all the time to the idea that the amount of research, the amount of data that has to be collected at CERN before they can declare something a discovery is colossal. And of course, most of it is just noise. There isn't a signal, as it were. So the sheer volume of pages is my attempt to show that, as it were, the sheer volume of data that needs to be gathered. Let's have a look at a very recent one, although the idea of working on black with white as opposed to the other way around is not new for me. I've been making books like this for a while, but this one was specifically looking at the idea of dark matter. And I mentioned earlier that they are monoprinting techniques, effectively, in that the ink seeps through the paper and creates a stain on the other side. That refers not only to how the particles leave traces by interacting with the medium in the detector, but in this particular case, using the white ink, it seeps through quite forcefully. Gravity kind of drags it through about 5 pages. And of course, dark matter, although it doesn't interact with visible light, hence dark matter, it is affected by gravity, and that's how we know that it exists. It's distorting space-time, gravity, as it travels. And so the paper seeping, the ink seeping through the paper was referring to several things now, the traces of particles leaving the detector and the interaction of gravity with dark matter. The other thing to say, I suppose, is that there are films of these on my YouTube channel, and the rustling of the tissue paper as they're turned is sort of quite important, and provides the soundtrack of certain things that I've done. And in fact, the sound of the pens making the drawings is becoming increasingly important as well. Again, 40 pages, hand drawn. There's got to be a lot of information. There's got to be a lot of pages. Costas is analysing colossal amounts of data. So to just do a few pages is an insult to the physicists I'm working with, really. So these take quite a long time. They're drawn over a period of time, and they're not. Although I'm going through this one in the normal way, they're not drawn in the normal way. They're not drawn from left to right, as it were. I start them at various points in the book and then gradually work in between as the layers seep through. And then lastly, one I showed at the last talk, but it's become more important now, and that is some of them are on tracing paper and have holes cut in them. I'm not quite sure how obvious that is. I'll make it more obvious by putting my finger through. Again, why tracing paper? Twofold, really. One, you can You can see through it like the tissue paper. So you can, this idea of the building up of traces, the building up of data. The other reason for tracing paper is that you can hear that it makes an even more aggressive noise. And of course, I don't know how obvious it is, but they are scratched. And in some cases, there are not cut holes, but there are torn holes in the drawings. So it introduces this idea of a more embodied interaction of the visual forces rather than a more the coded equivalence that I was looking at. Now these have become important because they are starting to appear in three-dimensional pieces that I'm beginning to make. As you can see, loads and loads of pages. Right, let's leave that there and go back to sharing screen. Okay, so we've worked together. I've tried to understand quantum mechanics. I don't think I'm understanding it very well yet, but I'm understanding more and more every day. And it's been a very heavy research-based project. And I think Kostas is prepared to continue working with me because I completely changed my way of working. As I mentioned earlier, vast assemblages has been brought down to drawings. And this is why. This is the standard model. These are what makes up reality, if you like. These are the quarks here. We've got the different generations. They get gradually more dense, more massive as they go up this way. These are the leptons, including the electron that we all know about. Matter is really made up of just these three things. The others no longer exist unless they're created in the laboratory or the colliders. They were around at the Big Bang, but they've all decayed. And these are the force-carrying particles for the different forces. The gluon, wonderfully named by the physicists, carries the strong force and sticks the quarks together. You remember the film with the straights and the curves and the tones sticking between them. That was me trying to get at the use of the gluon. The photon, obviously the carrier of the electromagnetic force, light in certain wavelengths. And then we've got the Z and W bosons, which carry the weak force. And then we've got the Higgs boson, which is the kind of arch, the keystone of the arch that holds all these things together. And although that's sort of like the particle physics equivalent to the periodic table, you can actually put it together in different ways. So it's not yet clear that it's absolutely the way it should be. You can put it around this way because the Higgs is the crucial thing, the Higgs field. So every particle, don't think of it as a marble, think of it as a field spread out, vibrating across the universe. The Higgs field is never off. It's always on. It's always in the background, humming like the fan that I've got on. And it's interaction with the Higgs field that creates stuff that enables us to exist. So the Higgs, and here's a new way of realizing that. Here's a new way of showing that. This is the Higgs in the middle here. And this is actually an interactive one where you, well, not interactive, but it zooms around. And it's literally, I think it was designed a year ago. So it's a much more interactive way of doing it. Quantum magazine. If you Google quantum magazine, then you'll find this. This is a rather interesting way. So, but the point I'm trying to make is that these things aren't fixed yet. The periodic table, we know that it's correct. The predictions have that the gaps have been filled. Where they were predicted to be, they are indeed. But the standard model can be redesigned depending on which aspect you want to emphasize. So there's something else yet. And of course, it's only 5% of the universe. The other 95% is dark energy and dark matter. Now, these are the very early photographs of what you would see in your detector if you were working. This one in early 1900s. This one is a bubble chamber image, so it's a bit later on. But this is the sort of thing that you would be looking at. This is, physicists love to play around with them to make them more dramatic. This is a, it's an image from one of the cameras, from one of the bubble chamber images that's been photographed. But it's not quite as, in reality, not quite as exciting looking as that. I'm going to flick through these. It's a research-heavy project. So I'm constantly reading, making notes, trying to find these equivalents. And this was the breakthrough for me, reminding myself of Paul Klee. Do other artists feel that they talk to dead artists, or does that sound a bit weird? I have conversations with Paul Klee. I mean, I don't literally say it out loud, but it's in my head. And this is, of course, the famous, the point moves to become the line moves to become the shape moves to give a suggestion of 3D, and so on. And the famous quotes that it's constantly about movement, it's about formation, not form, it's about genesis, it's about the becoming. This all coincides exactly with the constant choreography of the particles. They are not fixed things. They are not little marbles. They are constantly changing through interaction with each other, interaction with the forces. It is a choreography, and that's why it gelled with Paul Klee so forcefully for me. Another huge influence, and he's not well known in England, Santiago Ramon y Cajal. Apologies to any Spanish speakers. I'm from Essex, so I mangle the English language, let alone the Spanish language. Nobel Prize winner, and early neuroscientist before there was such a thing as a neuroscientist. But he devised a way of improving the dyeing of microscopic slides of the brain, and then made exquisite drawings of these things, which have been a huge influence on me. And of course, starts this idea of where does art end, where does physics begin, art and science intermeshing together. He wanted to be an artist, but his dad wouldn't let him. His dad was a surgeon, so he had him come into the hospital where he was teaching, and he would make drawings for his father of the bone structures or the muscle structures from the cadavers and so on and so forth. And when he started to go out on his own, as it were, he got fascinated by photography. And when it was, when it had only just been invented, so he developed photographic techniques very, very early on and made these exquisite drawings from them. And this is this is my passion, if you like. This is this overlapping of areas. I can't stand this idea that we're all in boxes. And I've been in education for many years. And I'm constantly trying to suggest to people that don't worry about maths or geography or art, just make them curious, develop a creative curiosity. And I think this guy, Santiago Ramon y Cajal, is a fabulous example of someone who bridges those different disciplines and uses them to inform them. And the Surrealists found him and loved his drawings. and a famous physicist. This is one of his drawings. He did make sketches as well. This is Richard Feynman. But obviously he's famous for the Feynman diagrams, which is a way of visualizing how to do the maths with particle interactions. Not everyone liked them when he first came up with them, and some people refuse to use them, but they've become ubiquitous now. If you sit with a physicist and ask him about a certain interaction of certain particles, he will draw one of these. And it's the particle. It's a particle coming in from this side, another particle coming in from this side, and exchanging. They're colliding and exchanging a particle and changing their nature, as it were. But again, Richard Feynman is another one of these crossover characters. He loved the idea of, he hated the idea that you couldn't visualize what was going on at the quantum world. And although this isn't a visualization, really, it is at least something that you can see and look at and discuss rather than a bank of equations. So it reaches out to a wider audience, but actually it reached out to the physics community as well, because everyone uses them. And they are a guide to how you can then make the calculations necessary. And I just love the idea that this is actually one of his drawings. So it's an original finding. And I don't want to spend too long on another one of my themes, but drawing for everybody. This is Hermann Minkowski, who took Einstein's theory of relativity and worked out the geometry involved, hence space-time diagrams, which Einstein was very dismissive of, but then later on realized that actually it was a bloody good idea and he would adopt it. But this idea of being able to visualize and to draw is one of my hobby horses. My apologies to berate you with it. And Roger Penrose, famous theoretical physicist, mathematician, has sketchbooks, because I think he's still with us. I think he's still with us. He has sketchbooks. And he became fascinated by tessellation. And in fact started working with the artist M.C. Escher, and liked impossible diagrams. There's a Penrose triangle which kind of goes around. It's impossible, but you can draw it. And the famous Escher drawing of the tower, the endless tower, was designed by Roger Penrose, which I didn't know. Not a lot of people know that. So again, this idea that crossovers and crossing the boundaries. Another input into the project was very much my trip to Andalusia. My wife is a Spanish speaker. She's South American, but a fluent Spanish speaker, so she loves Spain. And I came across Islamic geometric patterns. And having seen all the Baroque oil paintings, the sort of cherubs that are so heavy you can barely lift them, to see something so delicate that wears its symbolism so lightly and so refined was fabulous. And we found in the Alhambra these lovely drawings that were just little sketches, I think, that they hadn't been developed. Right, I'm going to ignore all that. And these are some of these explain some of the drawings you were looking at before. These are the bubble chamber particle images which are being analysed, and I was very lucky to meet Gron at the university. And this is where it starts to get so interesting with linkages. Gron here worked at Fermilab for a while, and I had a book which was just for laymen called The Particle Adventure, I think it is, or The Particle Explosion. And the second page is this image, and I had it with me when I met Gron at the university. And he said, good Lord, it's Renee Jones. I worked with her. And I looked in the caption, indeed it was Renee Jones. So here she is with a proper caption on. The scanners would analyse the vast quantities of photographs that used to come out of the detectors in the 50s and 60s. And they were usually women, as the Bletchley Park analysis computers were always women. And these are the big scanners, which is where I got the idea for the objects, because the girls always have these the images on. Sorry, not the images, but the objects laid on the surface. Right, I'm going to flick now. I'm just going to flick through these. This is the university show, but it's all about the book. The giant collage that you're looking at, although not taken from a book, was all done on tissue paper, the size of book pages. And I was able to use some information. I was able to use some of the artifacts. So this is Hibbard's disk, which is a component from one of the early accelerators, colliders at the university. So it was all about tissue paper, and it became three-dimensional, which is coming to the fore again. Right, now, oh, and yes, I must just thank Sarah Bodman, who featured me in printmaking today a few weeks ago. Now, we are now going to attempt again to go to the side, and I want to just talk a little bit about and demonstrate why they look like they do. So, heavily influenced by Paul Klee, the point becoming, well, we won't draw it out, you saw the slide, the point becoming the line, and so on and so forth. So when I first started, my first thoughts about how can I find an equivalent system, Costas tells me that the particles have mass, charge, and spin. So I tried to come up with a series of lines and shapes and interactions that represented those. So mass, to start with, I started to make bigger shapes. And then I would work into those shapes to give them density, which was the way that I felt that I could get at mass. Charge, I would create shapes, and then I would sometimes work the inside of the shape, the positive, and that would be positively charged. And I would sometimes work the outside of the shape, and that shape would represent a particle that's negatively charged. Now, for artists, positive and negative shapes, positive and negative figure and ground, this is all kind of just bog standard stuff. But of course, relating it to the quantum mechanical properties of the particles, you start to get an artist able to communicate with a physicist. Now, here's where I started to come undone in the early stages, because the third property that is very important to know about is spin. And I thought, and this is where it becomes very complicated, because it's not normal spin as we understand it. My reading implied that it was how a particle reacts with a force. So I used to move the templates around and create a movement, an interaction with the templates that I was using. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. However, it turns out that wasn't really spin, it was chirality. It's to do with the rotation of the particle, not to do with its spin. So it became clear that I needed a slightly more holistic way of going about these things. So what I do is I cut templates that relate to different particle interactions. Some obviously are huge. I say huge, that's not obviously huge, but it looks huge on the screen. But when I'm working on very large drawings, obviously I need some really whopping great things. When I'm working on the small books, they're much smaller. So I started to interact the pen with the template as the particle interacts with the detector. and with each other. So there's sort of levels of this. And I would take the rhythms that I decided would represent that particular particle across, creating this field, which obviously for an artist is a visual field in which the negatives and the positives are going to interact. But for the physicist, every particle is a vibration or an excitation within its own field, the Higgs field being the crucial one where the particles gain mass. So I would start taking them across, and then certain visual events would start to occur in certain parts. So there'd be the beginnings of something which would then be developed. So certain shapes would be picked out, some positive, some negatively charged, and so on. And with the templates of this sort, I could quickly go from something that was curving around, decaying under the magnetic field of the detector. I could quickly switch to creating a more geometric shape as the lines gathered together to create more of a square, which could be then worked up, or could be worked on the opposite side and be made to appear negatively charged, and so on. So all of these particles, all of these templates represented different particles. And then at one point, I started to place them underneath the paper for the work that I'm doing at the moment. So they would pick up. You said trying to find the, let's go to the smaller one. So it would pick up the interaction would be below rather than above. That doesn't come out amazingly well in the camera. So that's why the drawings look like they do. And it's trying to find an equivalent to what's happening at the quantum level. So this is happening in the studio, or was happening over lockdown. So the beginnings of this idea of 3D is starting to come back again. Now, whether these are finished or not, I don't know. So this is some of the tracing paper pieces that I mentioned earlier. And I'm starting to build out from the surface so that the drawings literally build into space. Because it occurred to me that if I'm creating the equivalent series of forces and interactions, like the elemental particles are creating the world around us. And so my visual equivalents should create a three-dimensional form. So these are some early experiments in the studio where I was trying to experiment with that and to see how they might fit on to the drawings. Again, the book image coming again, the sketchbook, in contrast to the collider, and potentially having films projected onto some of these things, so I bring them together. I'm going to ignore those. I did a project for a doll's house, but I'm going to ignore them. So we come up right up to date. This is one of the detectors. This is Atlas. You can see how huge it is. And so I've been commissioned by Studio Kind, a new commercial art gallery down in Devon, to make some huge drawings. So they are going to be 16 foot by 15 foot, And these are some of them laid out on the studio. Sorry, not the studio. I wish my studio was that big. On the floor, 3 floors up. So this is a direct response. This is trying to take the sheer scale of particle physics detection, but to put my visual equivalents, my visual forces, into that context. Still no color. Some people say it doesn't matter, but again, I'm thinking that if my visual forces, if my basic elements, point, line, and shape, color is one of the basic qualities, I should be working towards the introduction of color, but there's not been an obvious way in for me yet. You could say there is one, because the strong force particle physics refers to it as having 3 different qualities, red, green, and blue, but they're just labels. They don't actually mean anything in that context. But the latest things I've been doing for Studio Kind, and the idea is to have 2 huge drawings on either side, which will immerse you in the quantum world, as it were, and then to have there's a smaller room, to have some of these rolls going around the room, so that you're immersed in a smaller quantum experience. Because CERN itself is a layered collage of detection methods, in the sense that it's been built up over time, and the first accelerators are still operating, and they use those. So it goes in, the particles go into a certain area, they build up a certain amount of speed, and then they're brought into the new modern part, and brought up more speed, and so on. So the idea of smaller areas generating greater speeds as they gradually get up through the more modern technology struck me as quite an interesting idea. And you can see the size of some of these things going on. Right, so I became fascinated by David Bohm, one of the particle physicists, who has, the other thing about particle physics is it has weird things going on. There's something called entanglement, which means particles can talk to one another, influence one another, no matter how far apart they are, instantly, disobeying Einstein's nothing moves faster than the speed of light. So what's going on? Well, David Bohm would say, well, he would when he was alive, we're on a, like flatlanders on a one-dimensional plane. We can't understand 3 dimensions. So we can't understand higher dimensional activity. And one of his analogies was that imagine something that's enfolded. You can't any longer understand it. It has to be unfolded for you in order for you to be able to see and understand it. So I started making drawings which roll up, but because they're transparent, you still see what's in the roll, as it were. And it relates to an early theory of particle physics, which is not theory, which is when they thought there was ether as opposed to Einstein's space-time. They thought perhaps matter was not in the ether. Lord Kelvin was and you could say, of course, that some of these early depictions of the more modern theories of the atoms, you could say they look a bit like knots, so perhaps they weren't so crazy after all. But of course, now we know that the solar system idea of an atom is also, unfortunately, not true. But out of that work came a series of films as well. I'm just going to play you a couple. So I think you could see from that that it's not only about enfolding information that is contained then within the role, it's also this idea that the role can become a wave. So I'm looking at the idea of the particle as a thing that we can say, there it is, but also the idea of the particle as a field or wave. They have what's known as wave-particle duality. So we can't ever say, there it is, unless we measure it, because it's spread out in its field, which is why Costas always refers to the particles as excitations of their field. Okay, so a couple of last thoughts, and then just a little bit of info on the educational side. What I was hoping to do down at Studio Kind, because North Devon is and Cornwall are areas of high naturally occurring radioactivity. I applied for some funding to try and find some radioactive pigments that I could make the drawings from. And there's a seam just not far from the gallery on the coast called a Bidford Black, which is a local pigment. And so I was hoping to get some funding to go down and test some of these things. We've been doing it with friends. People have been sending me pigments. Obviously, we've not been encouraged to move around during the pandemic. And again, the university have been great. They've been testing some of the samples. So far, it's taken ages to get into them. But so far, the results are disappointing. We haven't found a significant radioactive pigment that's safe, as it were. I don't want to deform myself if possible. But that's one of the ways. I'd love to have a drawing which is made from stuff that involves the very particle interactions, i.e. radioactivity, that the drawings are inspired by or made about, forming equivalent to. I don't like saying that inspired by, it's too vague. Right, I'm conscious I've spoken for long enough really, so I'm going to flick through these. We have won an award for the outreach, or Costas has, here's the man himself, but it's for his work with myself and the dancer, Maria Pardalaki, who he works with doing dance workshops of dance and particle physics. And these are just some slides of the workshops that we've done, trying to find a way to reach out to primary and secondary, these are secondary, and get the idea of excite them about particle physics, but excite them about breaking boundaries, excite them about visualizing and understanding through drawing. I won't go into what these mean. Well, and actually I will this one. This is explaining someone the idea that quarks are held together with gluons, and the more you pull quarks apart, the greater the force, the greater the strong force, hence its name, is, and it pulls them back together. If you do manage to separate them, you create new quarks. How do you explain that to a young person who's not interested in science, perhaps? Well, what about pencils and elastic bands? And they have to draw against the tension of the elastic band representing the strong force. So it's a way of embodying the experience. And one thing that has proved incredibly successful is the workshops that we do, where they act out and make a small film about a particular particle interaction. So this is two quarks again, with the gluon holding them together. Oh, and now we've got antiquarks. And just in case you didn't realise, the first one was a collision event. So we do these workshops where we find equivalents to particle interactions using fine art visualization methods, drawing, collage, photography, and performance. And we've now tried it with primary schools as well, where they make characters based on the particles. So you tell them that there's a photon, it's light, it travels at the speed of light. How are you gonna come up with a character that represents that? You won't bother with that. Oh, this is the idea of communal drawing. You know, this constant interaction and choreography. Why one person in a studio? Why not a group of people being invited to collaborate and to interact together? And I've been teaching Kostas and Dimitra how to draw. My physicist, 2 doctors. I'm the only non-doctor. I'm going to have to get some. And this was us discussing the drawings for the Studio Kind exhibition, which is coming up. And I'll finish on an advert.
We've got a comment that was actually really interesting. The way that you did the metal spirals with the 3D drawings almost looked like you were making physical sound, which is, I thought was quite an interesting comment. But
sorry, which bit were they referring to?
If you put that comment, can you tell us? I assume it's the one where it's on the table, coming out of the book.
Oh right, that was actually piano wire. So actually, if you hang it and allow it to knock against itself, it plays relatively musical notes. Because I got a giant. I'm a hoarder, and somebody offered me an enormous roll of piano wire, and I thought, well, I don't know what I'm going to do with it, but it just sounds too good not to have. So it was only 30 quid, and I've been using it for years. The flying pages is a motif that goes back quite a long way for me. Sketchbooks have always been crucial. And now they're seen as a kind of as the equivalent to Kostas and his colliders, but they've always been crucial. And the flying pages motif refers back to my mother, who suffered from dementia. And it was when I used to talk to her, and she used to get very confused about what she was trying to say and get very muddled. And it was almost as if the pages of what she was trying to articulate were all getting jumbled up. And so the flying pages motif was a sort of a part of my previous practice, in a way, to do with nonsense and a lack of logic, and things flying out of control. But of course, they also now reference the idea of the energies in the particle colliders.
Oh, that's fantastic. Dealing with people with dementia, I think that is actually a very elegant way of being able to present what's really going through when they're trying to understand you.
Well, I did a show with Graham Berquist, who's a very, very skillful traditional painter at Centrala, and he exhibited. We sort of literally worked together, and so he would put something, and I would put something on top of it, and so on and so forth. And it was to do with this idea that there's sense and there's logic and there's nonsense and there's illogic, but they're not necessarily one good, one bad. It's just two different ways of looking at things. And the old idea of the genius is only one step away from madness, or the madman is only one step away from being a genius. So one shouldn't condemn something that's not logical. It might be. And recent, I mean, I ran out of time to talk about it really, but one of the things I've been putting to my physicist recently is there a chance that the quantum world, this difficult access, tiny space where all these things are going on that create everything else, and there's some weird things happening down there, that don't survive coming up into a more normal reality, as it were. Entanglement kind of dribbles out. They're finding ways. I mean, we're going to have quantum computing before I die, I think. But the idea that it decoheres as it comes up to the surface. And some of the physicists that I was reading about, Wolfgang Pauli, worked with Carl Jung. So I started to think: is the quantum world, is what's happening on that scale potentially the unconscious of the universe, as opposed to the conscious, in the same way that our unconscious minds and our conscious minds are constantly interacting, and the dream imagery sort of comes up from the unconscious, and archetypal imagery comes up from the unconscious, but never survives intact as it comes into the conscious part of your mind. So my physicist is very pragmatic. He's sort of, dark matter is a particle, we'll find it. I just need to look in the right place. So he tends to sort of steer a little bit wide. It gives me a wide berth when I go off on one of my flights of fancy, but it's been intriguing me, that idea, increasingly.
That's really, really interesting. And we've got another comment come through. It's amazing how you're managing to bring it into schools, the way that you're getting them to understand quantum physics in a simplified way, and through the arts as well.
Well, I've always been in education. So when we had some EU funding, remember when we were part of the EU? Oh, those were the days. We got some EU creations funding to take. I mean, Costa sees it as he uses me to outreach physics, but of course my Trojan horse is what I'm interested in is art and science being part of the same thing. It's part of this idea of creative curiosity. Don't think of yourself as a scientist or an artist or a geographer or a historian. Just be curious and see where it leads you. Let's get rid of the primary school curriculum, give them sketchbooks and teach them how to be curious. Then we can say, oh, that's interesting. You've done a drawing of that pine cone and you've noticed that there's a strange spiral going around. Okay, actually, we need to look at some maths now to understand that. I mean, it sounds pie in the sky, but I don't think it is. And to bore people with sort of course you have to teach them some basics, of course you do. But there should be sort of creative curiosity built into the curriculum. I would give everyone a sketchbook.
Yeah, I completely agree with that.
And have them drawing from the minute they start. I mean, kids want to draw anyway. Try and stop them. Imagine if they thought it was actually part of it was okay when you're not in an art lesson to be drawing. Well, if you've noticed something, draw it, put it down, and then analyze it.
I really like that idea, and I find myself slipping into that sort of idea as a mother teaching my little one. I mean, she's not even one yet, so she has no clue what I'm saying to her, but she will pick things up and I'll sit there and I'll talk to her about it.
You never know what they're taking on board.
You don't.
When we did the primary school ones, I was skeptical that they would understand, but we did a pass the parcel activity to start with. I made drawings of different things, so quarks, neutrons, protons, gradually through to cells, molecules, and then to stuff like a shoe or a bucket. And they passed the parcel round, and every time I stopped talking, we didn't have any music, they unwrapped a layer and we pinned it on the board and we said where it was on a scale of bigness to smallness. And I made these drawings as beautifully as I could, so they felt they were unwrapping a present and a gift. And then we made a diagram next to it so that they could kind of, because the cell I'd drawn was perhaps a little bit too a bit excited and carried away. But there are diagrams of cells that are easier to sort of understand. So there was this drawing that they unwrapped, and we said, well, what do you think it is? And sometimes they would know, and then we'd show them the diagram, and then sometimes they'd remember, but sometimes they wouldn't know. And it went on this giant scale of bigness to smallness. And as they were unwrapping the layers, they got down to quarks. I mean, they never heard of quarks. Of course, they hadn't. They were primary school kids. But they went out, and then we gave them badges, so they were all a particle. Now, if there'd have been time, my next cunning plan was they were going to start to interact with each other. So two quarks were going to be held together by a gluon. But one of them went out. He rushed out his dad came to pick him up. And his dad said, "Oh, did you have a good time?" He said, "I'm a quark. I'm a quark." And I thought, well, okay, that'll do me. That's brilliant.
That's fantastic. I mean, it's so surprising what kids can actually understand. I mean, even with my nephew, when I first met him, he turned around to me and he said, and he told me exactly how we see how eyes are wired to the brain in the slightly younger version of what it would actually be, but they know, they really do understand.
One of the drawings I showed you from Santiago Ramon y Cajal is literally the information coming from the retina. And he was the guy who worked out which direction the information was flowing in the brain. He won the Nobel Prize in 1905 or something with another guy who held the opposite view. But they didn't know which was correct at the time. Golly, he was the one who designed the method of staining that Cajal actually improved. But it turned out that Cajal was right. I mean, he was a fascinating character. Never heard of him you don't hear him in England very much, but he's kind of like, in Spain, he's kind of like known like Darwin. And his autobiography is read like Darwin's is read in England. But he's just, the drawings are just so gorgeous. I mean, regardless of whether you look at them from, I must work out which way the information is traveling down the neuronal pathways, or whether you just think, Jesus, look at that. And it's like an event, the line meanders around and it becomes a shape, and then it becomes another, and then it goes dotted, and so it's Paul Klee.
Yeah.
And it's particle physics. That's what's going on at the quantum level. These things are constantly changing and transforming and decaying and reappearing. Particles, for energy becomes mass again, and a particle pops up. It's How can you? Somebody said to me, "How long are you going to keep going on this project?" I said, "Well, when I get bored of how reality works."
That's many lifetimes. Yeah.
And I mean, if there's a physicist listening and I've said something stupid, I apologise. That's not a reflection on Professor Nikolopoulos. It's a reflection on the heat. Actually, I usually get it better than that.
And we've got someone saying, "Thank you so much for showing us that physicists do also draw what they're looking at. Do you think they do it to understand themselves what's going on, or do you think they're doing it to be able to showcase to other people to understand what's going on?"
The physicists themselves?
Yeah. I
mean, I think some of them, the ones that I really find interesting, like Cajal, like Feynman, like Roger Penrose, they naturally produce sketchbooks. Because they're curious. This is curious again. And if you're curious, you want to make a note of things. And you don't always want to make an equation or take a photograph, because who looks at the photographs? I mean, I've got 950 photographs on my phone. Do I ever look at them? Of course I don't. Do I look through my sketchbook? Yes. So drawing just slows you up. And I think that's the interesting thing. And the scientists that have this kind of visual bent, Einstein he didn't draw, I don't think. I haven't found out that he did, but he used to come up with visual thought experiments. So I find that very interesting. In a way that. And of course, it is maths. I mean, Costas, bless him, he would love me to understand more about maths. I used to say in talks like this that my maths was barely GCSE level, but actually I looked at a GCSE textbook the other day and I'm going to have to revise that because I didn't understand a bloody word of it. My maths is well short of GCSE level. I didn't realise they do. When did they start doing those things in GCSE? And so, but it's another language then. But that in itself is quite interesting. I mean, everything is language and convention. That's what is kind of intriguing. And what I'm trying to do with the equivalence, really, I'm trying to come up with a system where a physicist could look at the drawings and say, oh yes, I know why he's done that, because he says this and this and this and this and this. But of course, I don't know enough, and I keep making mistakes. So I have to take the holistic view for a while in order to get it. But the interesting thing from my point of view is that even a drawing that doesn't work from a physics point of view might still be an interesting drawing, because it's an equivalent, not an illustration of. So I can claim success regardless.
But that's a really interesting stance, because maths is seen as a universal language for those who understand maths, and you're making your art for everyone else. Because I always say I'm more like a year 3 level maths, because I would never be able to help out anyone with maths.
I've probably got a condition. There seems to be so many of them around these days, but I look at a group of numbers and they just do not mean anything to me. In fact, I see them as patterns and shapes.
Yeah.
And they start to form themselves into interesting shapes, which I'm sure you're not supposed to. That's no good for adding up. And I still remember at school being stood in a circle, and the teacher sort of saying 5 sixes, 7 twos, and you had to know these things. And the trauma of the finger coming around. I can still remember. A long time away from school.
So yeah, it's so amazing what actually sticks with you in that sort of thing. I'm absolutely loving listening to your passion for this sort of thing, but time is almost up. So we will say one more question that we've had, which is, are you going to put your tissue books up for sale? Are you going to do replicas?
They are all hand drawn, so they're not, I don't reproduce them. And yes, they are for sale. Although I'm not, I should get one of these proper websites where the sketchbook and the collider.com is really me and Costas laying out what we've done, and other things go on it once we've done it. It's not a selling platform. I suppose I really need to, but they trouble. It's terrible talk. I shouldn't talk out of it. The books take so long and are so long that the price usually is around £900 to £1,200. So you're not getting a casual audience, as it were, who are going to buy it. It's going to be collectors. And I've sold 2, I think it is. But they're a bit prohibitive in the way that I do them. There are films of them, or some of them. I work incessantly. In order to understand, I have to work. If somebody says to me, here's a problem, I get a sketchbook out and start drawing. And then very quickly that turns into a piece of artwork. Costas found that strange. He thought I should understand a bit more before committing myself. But drawing is a process of understanding. So if I make a drawing where I didn't understand it properly, it doesn't invalidate it as a drawing. It just means there's more drawing required. So I'm constantly working. So there's I think there must be 40 books now, perhaps. Sarah Bodman, I must just give her a shout out, who put me in printmaking today. She's a senior research fellow at Bristol University of West of England, and she runs the artist books course. She's always promoting my books, bless her, and she made one of them one of the top 10 books of 2015, 16 or something, I can't remember.
That's fantastic. That is well done.
So she's ever so sweet and such a lovely person.
Yes, it's been so interesting to be able to listen to you and to be able to make physics understandable to us all. And if you've really enjoyed Ian as much as I have, make sure to follow him on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook as Ian Andrews Fine Art, and follow his YouTube channels for all his videos, which is Ian Andrews. I've got all of that correct, haven't I?
Possibly, I don't know it myself.
We'll go with it.
I go to the sketchbook and the collider and then follow the links.
And this video will be available for those of you who have bought tickets and for the members of the Tebbs Gallery. In about a week's time, I'll send you an email with a private link for that. So thank you so much, Ian, for coming today, and thank you to everyone who has watched live and are watching this on repeat.
Thank you.
Right. I'll speak to you soon. Have a good weekend. Oh, have a good week. Off
to Devon on Sunday.
Oh, that's
going to take
lovely.
the stuff down to the gallery.
Yes. I'll pop over if I have some time.
I'll send you the poster.
Yes, that'll be good. I'll share that out as far and as wide as I can. I'll see you soon then.
Thanks, Kirstie.
Bye.